Hello and welcome to the With Intelligence by S&P Global Insight series. My name is Sam Dale. I'm the Managing Editor of Private Markets at With Intelligence by S&P Global. We're here today to talk about infrastructure. I'm joined by our in-house infrastructure expert and infrastructure editor, Viola Keown, and we're going to have an interesting discussion today. So how was 2025 for fundraising in infrastructure?
Thank you for having me, Sam. First of all, I'm really happy to be here. So fundraising in 2025 for infrastructure was a record-breaking year. With Intelligence recorded around $130 billion of capital raised by funds and an additional $20 billion raised by co-investment vehicles. Now, this is a 126% jump year on year. So a very, very positive environment. In terms of what drove the success, I think it was true what a lot of the infrastructure GPs kept saying since 2022, which was the last record year followed by two record low years, which is the denominator effect was having an impact on LP allocations into infrastructure, meaning basically that when public markets collapsed in 2022,